Okay, I think the first thing is standing in front of you. I guess I should be honest, because that seemed like a generally good place to start. If it is, I should say that I'm not really here as a director. I'm not really here as a professional, in a sense. Just like you, I'm here because I have questions. I guess we're all born with questions. I mean, I often think that when a newborn baby lets out its first shriek, it's because it wonders where it is. I mean, it must be a shock, having left the comfort of the womb, suddenly find yourself being smacked on the backside and held upside down. But it seems that being smacked on the backside and being held upside down is about the way we live. So I'd like us to think of this as a discussion amongst equals, really. And why do I say that? Because I know that you all have questions. In fact, I know for sure that the questions you have are probably ones I have too. I know for sure there'll be differences, but the differences won't be in the questions, will they? They'll actually be in the answers. And herein lies the key to culture. You see, I've been lucky enough to travel over a large part of the globe. I've spent time with, well, virtually Stone Age communities and then extremely sophisticated communities. And what struck me always, that when you get to a certain point of contact, every culture deals with the same set of questions, those basic questions that every human being has to deal with. And that culture itself is actually the answers to those questions reified, i.e. the answer to those questions presented as being the only truth. So it seems to me that I should stand here before you today and actually talk about the questions I have and say to you, what answers do you find to those questions? That's really why I'm a filmmaker. I mean, if I was left to my own devices, I'd rather be a novelist. Well, why? Because as a novelist, you don't get dragged out to different parts of the world. You can sit in your own kind of ivory tower and write about things that really interest you. Filmmaking takes you right out into the world, takes you out into a world where you have to deal with the world as it is. That's an adventure. And I think I'm discovering at this age in my life that I've dedicated my life, to my surprise, to following that adventure. That brings us to a question of what is filmmaking? Well, you are in a school of communication, aren't you? That means you're here because you have questions about communication, because you have things you want to say. And that's very beautiful. So in a way, it's an honor for me to come here and stand in front of people who have the grace to understand that questions are important, and the desire to communicate those questions has equal importance. That's a very, very beautiful and very moving thing for me. When I was at school, I was a terrible pupil. I really was. I loathed school. I loathed the fact that I would sit in a class and the history master, forgive me, would pull down a large map and show the areas in red and say, that's the British Empire. Well, also, the map was made in 1938. I was at school a lot later than that, in 1960. So what empire was he talking about? So very early on, as a child, I began to realize a very, very crucial thing about human beings, and I really want you to consider what I'm going to say next. You see, the truth is, no one in this room actually knows where we are. Well, you do in a sense, don't you? Because, yes, we're in a lecture hall. And yes, the lecture hall is in Pamplona, and Pamplona's in Spain, ergo, and we're on the Earth, and that's somewhere in the universe. But that's not knowing very much, is it? Really? Are we to base our whole life on those simple geographical parameters? It's not sufficient, is it? So then an interesting question begins to come into our mind, which is, well, if we don't know where we are, how on earth can we know who we are? And the truth is, finding out who you are is all your journey, isn't it? Communication is about trying to express who you are and listen to what other people are saying about who they are. So let's start from a very basic place. Let's talk about reality, because I presume that when you're communicating, you're imagining you are communicating reality. So let's ask some questions about this reality we're so sure about when we communicate. And you'll see that this will then begin to fit into the whole idea of what film might be and what communication is. So let's try a test. I'm going to try a test where I want you to follow the lines of this test, because in the lines of this test, you're effectively, in a certain way, going to vanish. So for a moment, just feel how solid you are. You can feel the seat underneath you. You can feel the pressure of the seat against your back. You can feel the weight of the floor under you, can't you? You know that if you were to tap the counter in front of you, it's solid and it's hard. There's a difference between you and the counter. I mean, I guess that's what we would call a sane view of reality. But let's look at this a little bit closer. So I'd like you to imagine a man is standing before you, not me, but say a man is standing here, and he's approximately 6 foot high, and he has all the attributes we've just said he has. He's a solid human being, and he's capable of communicating. Now I'd like you to shrink, or maybe he gets bigger. Now I'd like to imagine that his hand, only his hand, is now the size of his body, and you're staring at this hand. Mentally do that. Make a picture of it. Now you're going to get smaller still, and smaller still, and smaller still, and smaller still, until now you are staring at a single molecule of this person's skin. And that molecule stretches from the ceiling to the floor. And now we're very tiny indeed. And what do we find when we look at that? Oh, we find something very beautiful and very strange, because the molecules which exist in a pattern are held together by strange forces, electromagnetism, energy. And now we have the chance to get smaller still. Now we have to go inside the molecule that is inside the hand, that is part of the skin. As we go inside the molecule, we find out it's made of atoms. Atoms, incidentally, discovered by the ancient Greeks without microscopes. How on earth did they do that? How did the human mind consider that all material things were made of atoms when they had no microscope to know whether that was true or not? Saying something very extraordinary about this human mind, and very extraordinary things about reality, which we'll come to in a moment. So let's continue our journey. We're going inside this molecule, and now we're confronting an atom, and the atom is this size. But as we get closer, the atom gets bigger, and what do we find with that atom? We see the nucleus of the atom. And around it spin particles, electrons, in guided patterns. But here's the surprise. If the nucleus is this size, the electrons are spinning in Madrid. Between the nucleus and the electrons is emptiness. Well, maybe not emptiness. Maybe what is making those electrons spin around that nucleus is a field. But what's a field? We talk about the electromagnetic field, the gravitational field. What are they? We don't quite know. We know it's something to do with energy, and honest scientists will do one of two things. They either stop and say, we don't know what it is, but we know what it does, and we're content with that. That's an honest statement, I think short-sighted, but it's an honest statement. Some other scientists will say, no, let's try and understand what is the basic constituent of the particle. Now we're very, 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 very tiny indeed, and we're existing inside an atom. And then a strange thing happens, because passing through the atom comes a particle. Tiny. To us, probably about the size of a golf ball. Now, if you take a step back to this man standing there, which, by the way, is you, those particles are passing through you now. By the hundreds of thousands, they're coming through this roof, through you, and maybe going 2 kilometers into the Earth's crust. Why? Because to them, there is nothing there. Isn't that an extraordinary statement about reality? Don't we begin to see something extraordinarily beautiful emerging? Our reality is relative to our size. So yes, we do exist, but at a certain point we don't exist. So we are what? A construction of something. But we don't know what it is that's done that construction. It appears that at a certain level in nature, there appears to be a desire for order, a desire for pattern, but we don't know where that comes from. So when I say we're lost, I'm not saying something that should frighten you. I'm saying something extraordinarily beautiful. And I'll tell you why I think it's beautiful. Because what is the one conclusion you can draw from this sense of what reality is at its base, i.e. that we are at a medium point between the smallest particle and the largest mass of particles, which would be a star. We're exactly midway in size between them, which is rather interesting. What does that say? It says, indeed, that we're lost, but it also says we are the manifestation of something. See, in the Big Bang, whatever the Big Bang was, which may have been a collision of universes, or may have been something we simply don't understand, out of something smaller than a particle to begin with, came everything that is in existence now, including you, because you are made up of particles that have been around for billions of years. The periodic table was made up out of pure energy, so that everything in the universe was contained in something much smaller than the eyepiece of that camera. That's a thought you must hold on to for all your lives. Why? Because it's a beginning of understanding where we are. And that's beautiful. And why is it beautiful? It's beautiful because if you understand that you are, and let's come back to our own size now, you are very much present and also not present at all. You are left with one extraordinary sense. And that is the intense, intense beauty of creation. And I believe because of that, you understand what love is. Particles attract each other. It appears that in the interplay of particles, in the vibration of particles, many of which have the same properties, they change what they are. As a Korean physicist once said to me, she said, "Roland, you must understand, the entire universe as we know it, the entirety of creation, is a giant jazz riff. It's all music." And she says it's a jazz riff because it's changing. But it's changing according to basic patterns. You, my dears, each and every one of you, are part of that jazz riff. That is why communication matters. You are part of the grand orchestra. Everything you communicate, if it comes from a place of truth, or if it comes from a place of imagination, or if it comes from a place of misunderstanding, contributes to the total pattern. So you see, when you communicate, you're doing what nature has created you to do. And that brings me to film. And it brings me to why I think love is such an important thing to explore. Particles, in a sense, love each other. They annihilate each other, that's absolutely true, under certain conditions, but actually that annihilation is change. One particle changes into another because of the effect of another particle on it, because their vibrations change. And because when we begin to understand particles truly, we understand there is no such thing as a particle. There is only a vibration in a field. And what is that vibration? That vibration is potential. So you are all a mass of vibrations in a field capable of change. And your brains, which are made of your brain that you have in your head, but also the brain that you have in your heart, because do you know that there's a neurological system in your hearts? Do you know that there are synapses in your heart that actually are the same synapses you have in your brain? Do you know that when you say, "I felt it in my heart," you are telling the truth? And this is part of finding out who you are. And for many years, science has told us that the heart is simply a pump. But for many years, science has told us that the earth is simply a machine. But my friends, the heart is not only a pump, neither is the world only a machine. It is a construct that appears to be doing something. It appears to have feeling. It appears to be guiding us. The ancient Greeks, Aristotle, I think, although I may have this wrong, talked about men with no chests, which is a kind of odd thing. What does that mean? What it actually means is, he was talking about men who could not listen to their heart because they were ruled only by the brain. So this teaches something else about who we are. Oh, we're a dialogue between reason, which comes out of here very often, and something else which appears to be stored here, which appears to be guiding what the brain does. Now, forgive me, all this might seem a long, long way away from filmmaking. But not so far as we think, is it? Let's think about filmmaking for a second. Filmmaking is a means of communicating using what? Photons. Well, photons are both there and not there. Photons are part of a field. And photons are about complex parts of field, which are you or culture. So yes, isn't this exciting? Communicating and making films is part of the journey to find out where we are. And part of the way of doing that is to begin to learn who we are. Now let's lay all that one side for a moment. How do we know who we are? Well, I mean, you know, don't you, in a way, but although I've destroyed a little bit of your confidence in knowing who you are, I hope, but given you a certain delight in saying, boy, we're a lot more complex than we thought. But I haven't really given you any guidance into the question of actually who you might be. Well, here's the interesting thing. Let's go back to those particles, those fields. A good scientist will tell you that they don't really know what a particle is, but they know what it does. They know what it does. You will never really know who you are, but you will develop a history about what you do. You will never really know who your husband or your lover or your best friend or your parents are, but you will draw conclusions from what they do. And the act of doing is what? It's the act of choosing. Well, it's the act of choosing if we decide we're more than machines. A robot does things, but I don't think yet, nor do I think ever, if we purely go mechanically, will we discover an intelligence that actually emotionally understands the value of its choices. They may do it mathematically, that's a very different thing. And we may use maths in our choices, that's a different thing too. But for our purposes, the interesting thing is choice. And all stories are really about choice, aren't they? A good story is about A, suddenly deciding he wants to do B, coming up against C, who wants him to do D. But isn't that what our lives are like? Don't we do that all the time, actually? Our parents, we think are A, but they want us to do B, and we really want to do C, and in that struggle, what is going on? Something new is being made, and something that new is you, but here's the surprise, it's also your parents. Don't believe that you don't teach your parents. See, again, science is going through a wonderful and radical revolution. 15 years ago, no scientist could have stood here and said with all honesty that he thought that the human brain was capable of change. What he would have said is, after the teenage years, your brain is fixed forever. But it isn't. Because science, which, thank God, is very often in the hands of people who can't stop asking questions, has begun to discover that the brain regenerates all the time. The brain is plastic. You can reteach your brain endlessly. And of course, that's what things like meditation are about. Much psychology and psychiatry deal with these kind of images. So again, we come to an extraordinary thing, which is communication, just like particles communicating, is you participating in an act of creation and telling a story that goes inside people's minds and gives them the chance to change. It doesn't make them change, and that's the beauty of it, isn't it? That's the beauty of communication. And that comes back to what I was saying about culture. Great communication says to each person who is listening or participating in it, you, like me, are part of this giant, giant system, which we don't fully understand, but we share the question, and these may or may not be the answers. See what you make of this. It's a two-way thing. Stanley Spencer, who was a wonderful artist, English artist, who was painting really in the 1940s, extraordinary man, never had any money in his life. He painted great, long, beautiful paintings about 30 feet long. He was never able to see these paintings because he could never have enough money to unroll them. So he'd have to store them under his bed and unroll a little bit, paint a little bit, roll it up, paint another little bit, in a strange way, like making a cartoon, making a movie, actually. He had to do little bits. Anyway, eventually he became very well known, had a big exhibition at the Tate Gallery in London, became highly successful, at least in terms of praise. And I remember watching an interview that he gave when he came out of this exhibition, the first exhibition he'd had in his life, but here it was in the biggest gallery in London. And a BBC critic stuck a microphone in front of him and said, "Mr. Spencer, you must really enjoy this," and talked a little bit about his life. But then he asked a question that was very interesting. He said, "But Mr. Spencer, a lot of critics don't like your work," which they didn't. And Spencer said a very, very beautiful thing. He was about 75, 80 at that stage, rather astute little glasses, and he said, "Ah, yes, the critics. It's so strange, really, isn't it? Because they think they look at my paintings. But of course, it's the other way round. Think about that. Critics think they look at paintings. In fact, the paintings look at them." That's true of film, my friends. That's true of every story. When you say, "I didn't like that film," you are revealing what? Yourselves. If you say, "I love this aspect of the film," what are you revealing? Well, yes, you're revealing an aspect of the film, but you're revealing aspects of yourselves. And you know what? If you understand that, that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Because if you're sharing aspects of yourself, you are capable of doing what? You're capable of changing. So communication, then, is about a number of things, isn't it? It's about finding out who we are, why we are, where we are, what we might be. But all with this basic idea that we love to communicate because we love the other. We love the other. And there are two ways to deal with that, aren't there? And we watch it in the world. You can hate the other or love the other. And where does hatred of the other come from? It comes from fear. And what's the fear? The fear comes back to this basic thing that we don't know who or where we are. So we can cling on to beliefs. A belief. I believe human beings are this, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And if I really believe A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I will be a good human being. Oops, what happens here? I see somebody who believes in X. Oh, that's terrible because that threatens my belief. Therefore, I should get rid of that. Don't you know that happens in life? Don't you read about it in the newspapers? Don't you see it in films? And don't you hate it, really? Even when you think you love it? Doesn't some side of you say, but maybe X has a beauty? Maybe I am not fully exploring what X is? And so you decide to explore it. And that, my dears, is an act of love. It's an act of attraction. It's an act of learning. It's an act of learning who or where we are. So you've come to a wonderful place to study communication. Because that's the stuff of life. All of nature is communicating. So that's why I told you that long story about reality at the very beginning. Because I want you to understand as clearly as I've come to understand, although for God's sake, I'm not a scientist, that I've come to understand that we are in a giant vortex of communication that appears to have a point. And that the choices we make are part of that vortex. But here's the rub, guys. We can get it wrong. Whoa, that's scary. But is it scary? No, it's not scary, because making mistakes, which nature appears to make, because it appears to correct itself, nature appears to be a kind of equilibrium all the time. And let's face it, equilibrium is simply the balance between two opposite points. So it doesn't really exist. It's a moment, it's a space. So getting things wrong appears to be part of the natural process. Thank God we take a step closer to knowing what we might be about and where we might be. We are mistakes. Whoa, that's rather nice. Everybody in this room is a mistake maker, including me, and I've made more mistakes than I care to think of. But it makes us laugh, doesn't it? And why does it make us laugh? Because we know it's true. And when we find things that are true, we find them funny. Because laughing is our way of communicating what? Enjoyment, surprise, delight. Those are the things that make us laugh. So I've learned as a filmmaker and as a person who occasionally, by the way, only occasionally does this kind of thing, to very much appreciate a laugh as coming from a place of great truth. So when you communicate, however you do it, be alert to laughter. Because laughter very much takes you to a place of the truth. It'll also expose falsehood. People laugh at what's false as well as laughing at what's true because they find it funny that this could be held as a belief. So laughter is a remarkably important thing. So forgive me, I've taken you on a very general journey, but I don't think you can understand me. I certainly can't understand myself. You might do better at it than I do. Without explaining what I think this whole process is about. And where has that led me? And why did I stand in front of you and say I'm not here as a director? Well, the fact that I'm a director simply doesn't matter. I could be an egg maker. If I had the same enthusiasm for life as I had, it wouldn't matter because I would find in the simple complexity of an egg the same journey. I mean, really, if I was to take an egg and the idea that it contains life and how is that life made and what is the chicken or whatever it is, the reptile that comes out of it actually going to be and what's its purpose, I'd be asking the same questions, wouldn't I? And I may want to communicate these kind of answers. So what I'm trying to say to you is that my journey is partly chance. But what is chance? Well, let's go back to for the last time, to my description of where I think we are in this extraordinary universe. Science is kind of teaching us that chance is random. But I think that's bad science. So any scientists amongst you will have to forgive me because I don't hold a degree in science, so I'm really stepping right out of my course. However, I'm a human being, so I have a right to step outside the course if I can. Chance actually is to do with choice. A thing may be A, it may be B. We know from quantum physics that particles are capable of being in a superposition where they are neither one thing nor the other. It's both a wave and a particle. It's both here and everywhere. Until what? Until there's a conscious intervention by an observer. In other words, until someone looks at the particle is nowhere. So what we're saying is that the conscious observer acts on the universe, and you are all conscious observers. Therefore, you are making choices all the time about what you see in relation to the particle who appears to respond to your choice. So we are making things, and through our choices we are making things. And that's remarkable and beautiful. Very early on, when I took these questions with me, I didn't know where I was to take them. Where would I go with all these questions that could be of any interest? Was it even a good idea? I remember one day asking my father whether he believed in God. I didn't see my father that often because he traveled a lot because he was part of the Foreign Office and he was a writer, but I loved him more than he knew, I think. But I asked him a question because I felt I could get an honest answer from him, and I said, "Pa, do you believe in God?" And he looked at me rather kind of surprised and said, I was 14, and he said, is that a real question, Roland, or is it a rhetorical question? I said, no, Pa, it's a real question. I want to know whether you believe in God or not. It sort of matters to me whether you do, because I think you know more about where you are than I do. And he looked at me and said, we lived in Switzerland at the time, he said, well, let me answer your question this way. Sometimes, when the mood takes me, and I have no idea what that mood is, I go up to the roof of the chalet where we lived at that time, and I can go out through the attic, and I lie flat on the roof. And I just wait. And I look up at the stars until an interesting thing happens. I realize there is no way I can ever be looking up. I am actually always looking down. When you think about it, since we're on the earth, there isn't any up. Well, there's no down either. There's just looking from here to there. And at that point, when I realize that I'm looking down, because space is there as much as it's there, a strange thing might happen. Because if I'm very lucky, the stars will reorganize themselves into a giant question mark. And that, you see, is God. God is the question, asking you to discover the answers. Man, isn't that beautiful? Man, isn't that biblical, actually? God is not the answer. And if he was, he wouldn't have created us. If he did create us, and I'm an agnostic, so I have no idea. But it's very possible, and everything I've explained to you could very possibly be the way God works. And the beauty of science may be that bit by bit by bit by bit, it understands in more and more sophisticated ways the way the universe functions mechanically. Not very good at discovering anything else, but that's the way it goes. So I took that reply of my father's and carried it out into the world. God is the question. And then I waited and went through the usual things. You know, when I left university, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was kind of lazy too, and I loved going to Italy, and I liked white wine, and I liked going dancing, and I liked the Beatles, and I liked anything really that moved, I would say. But one day my grandmother came to me and she said, I was sitting at home and I was listening to the Trout Quintet, I think, on the radio and drinking a glass of white wine, and my grandmother looked at me and said, darling, I'm so fond of you. You're one of my favorite grandchildren. You're always so happy, but I have a little tiny question for you. I said, what's that? And she said, you have a lovely lifestyle, don't you? And I had to admit that I did, because I did. And then she said, well, my question is this, very simple. Who is going to pay for it? You know that question, don't you? Well, of course, disguised in the question was something rather wonderful, because it wasn't really a question of who was going to pay for it. What she was really saying is, what choice are you going to make about living? Because I was marking time. I wasn't making any choices at all. So under the guise of what are you going to get a job, she was really saying, because she didn't say what job, and she didn't say that I really needed a job, but she said, make a choice about it, darling. She didn't say, if you make a bad choice, you'll have no money. She just said, who's going to pay for it? She gave me a certain autonomy. And I took that autonomy and decided to go and work in the theatre. A friend of mine who laughed a lot when I said I needed a job and said, well, what job could you do? Your friends have all been asking that, because you appear to be so lazy there's no job you could possibly actually fulfill. However, you like drawing, you like design, so we're going to find a job for you in a theatre as a designer. And I went to this little theatre and I started designing. And then by some strange fluke of life, I ended up directing. I won't tell you that story because that's funny, but it's also for another time. Except I will say I tried acting. That didn't work very well, because at the time I was in love with the leading lady, and because I was in love with the leading lady, I find myself on stage and the only lines I could remember were hers. Well, naturally, I wasn't in love with myself, was I? So I wouldn't remember what I had to say, but I was in love with her, so I could remember every line she said. But that wasn't much good on stage, because the only thing I remember was her line, so I said her line. And then I learned what the absence of love is, too, from the look in her eyes, when she realized she had to say mine. So we had to play the scene backwards, which was the first gender swap, I think, that's happened on the English stage. But I realized from that acting wasn't going to be the way that I was going to go. And to cut a long story short, I started directing, and I then became rather fascinated in working with children in theatre. I suppose those were early days for me, and I felt that theatre was a wonderful way of communicating, and I started working with handicapped children. And that was beautiful, you know, because with handicapped children, you had to communicate without sophistication. Well, no, you had to have a lot of sophistication to find out how to communicate simply. We dealt with autistic children who didn't communicate. And I tried to work out why they didn't communicate. And I began from my research to discover the reason they didn't communicate may have been, we don't know even to this day, that their nervous system was so organized that what to us were very, very simple things, for them were unbearable. So a simple question of, are you okay, to them created a tension and a nervousness that was unbearable. So they'd rather sit in a space where there was no input that would overexcite their nervous system. So we developed a technique. We would buy parachutes and we'd inflate them with hot air, and we would put lights on the outside and play music and let the lights change color and then wait. And the children would sit on the outside, but we wouldn't say anything. There was no stress, and bit by bit, one by one, those autistic children would get up and go inside this inflated, multicolor universe that we were making for them. And then inside that, we discovered we could play very simple games, like passing an object around. And bit by bit, they began to communicate because they began to communicate without stress. That was theatre. In a way, that was a film. Well, how was it a film? Well, it was a film like this. I made a world for those children in which they could inhabit and discover something about what they wanted to do and discover something about their environment. And what did I use? I used light and air. Well, what does film use? Well, it uses light, but it also uses air because the actors talk. Sound and light. Vibrations again. We all come back to vibrations. Luckily enough, and I won't go through my career because it's not that interesting, I found myself in a position where I could make films in other cultures. And that for me became the most crucial and wonderful thing. It's that film could record in a way and take people into cultures that weren't their own. So I found myself in the mission, for instance, in an extraordinary position of going to live for 2 weeks with a Stone Age tribe called the Waunana, who are now almost wiped out of existence, by the way, but that's life in Colombia with narco-terrorism. And so in a strange way, they're living out what the film was about. But this was a Stone Age village. They hadn't really seen a white man before. They knew nothing about television. I was a surprise. And the anthropologist I'd spoken to said, oh, you can't go to that village. We don't want you to go to that village. And I said, why? And they said, because you'll disturb the culture. And I said, well, I hate to say this, but everything disturbs culture, so I don't think that's appropriate. Well, what you're really saying then is these villagers have to live in a museum. I mean, it's not a zoo. And evolution and progress, that's what nature does. What you're really saying to me, it seems, is you think I'll be insensitive about how I affect their culture. That's a different question. And yes, I have a responsibility, don't I, then to go to the village and not be insensitive. But it's more insensitive to not go than it is to go, because by not going, I avoid the issue, and also would have deprived those people of something that became very important to them. But I knew also that if things worked well, I could get them to be in the movie, because who could play the Guarani better than a Stone Age tribe of Indians, who I believed would understand the problem of the movie better than I ever could? And you know what? That was true. So the beauty of my going there, I took a Polaroid camera. And with the Polaroid camera, I took a picture of myself, because the anthropologist said, oh, by the way, be very careful, because if you take a camera and photograph people, they will want to kill you or they'll feel threatened or whatever it is, which I totally understood, and you'll understand why in a moment. What I did was I took the Polaroid camera, I set it up in the village when they were confident, and I photographed myself, and a Polaroid came out. And 60 little children of all ages all crowded round and saw the Polaroid, which was me. And then I did it again. And they all saw that again. Then the next thing I knew, they wanted to be with me. So now I have a Polaroid of me and a lot of children. And then they wanted to get their parents. So suddenly I'm taking Polaroids of the whole village. Why did that work? Because I was communicating, wasn't I? What I was doing, I didn't just take a camera and go click and then walk off, which would absolutely leave people thinking I'd stolen something. No, I showed them that nothing was stolen and much was given. And from that, I then used television cameras, which I then brought, and encouraged them in a way to make a film. But I also told them the story of the mission. And in telling them the story of the mission, one man got up, and he turned around, he lifted up a little loincloth he was wearing, and there was a brand on his backside. And he said, I was branded when I was a young man by my Colombian owner, because I was found in the forest. And Indians in those days were branded. That was in the 1950s, I guess, not so long ago. So they understood the story of the film. And I'll end really by one final image. When we eventually put to them the idea that I'd like to make the film with them, they had a tribal meeting in which they set out the rules by which they were going to work with me. And they said the following. They said, we live in a village, you know, we are all interrelated in one way and another, so we don't like to be away from the village or our families. So yes, we'll go with you wherever you take us because we trust you, because I had communicated with them. We'll go wherever you want, but you must obey the rules. No family must be separated for more than the rising and setting of a moon. And we must live in the same way in a village. We must reconstruct the village as it is, and then we'll come with you. Those were basically their rules. They didn't ask about payment, about anything. That's what they said. So indeed, we flew them from the Pacific coast right across Colombia to the other side of Colombia. And when I went to the airport to see them being loaded onto the plane for the first time, I asked an old lady whether she was frightened, because this giant thing, none of them had ever flown before, was going to take off and go they knew not where. And she looked at me with this little beatific smile and she said, "No, I'm not frightened at all." She said, "I know we'll be safe." And I said, "Really? How do you know that?" She said, "Because I watched you feed this creature, this thing we're in." And I said, "Really? What did we feed it?" And with a little seraphic smile, she said, "Butterflies." So the tribe flew with me for 2,000 miles across Colombia on a plane filled with butterflies. Well, in a strange way, they were right, weren't they? Because butterflies are energy, and so is air, kerosene. I'm going to end here because that takes you a little bit to a sense of who I might be. So if you have any questions, you'll know where the answers come from and adjust your belief or disbelief of what I have to say accordingly. Thank you. Let's get down to what really excites me, which is your questions. So anybody has a question, put their hand in there, and I guess we can get mics to you. And don't be shy. Just there is no such thing as a bad question. Don't be shy. There must be a question that's come into your mind. There's one.
Good morning, Mr. Joffe. Thank you for being here today. In both the killing fields and the mission.
No, ponte de pie, que te vean.
Okay. Sorry. In both the killing fields and the mission, you told a very inspiring story. But I think these two productions have something in common. That is the idea of denouncing the violence against two people, the Cambodian people and the Guarani. So I wanted to ask you, what was first, the idea of denouncing the violence in the world, or the concrete stories of the Cambodians or the Guaranis?
Well, a very good question. And in a way, it's such a good question, it's rather difficult to answer, because it's a bit of both. One thing that interests me a lot is power. In fact, I think power, and as communicators, is very important for you to play with this idea. Power is, I think, the most basic emotion. Freud argued it was sex. I think he was wrong. I think power comes first and sex comes second, because much sexuality is involved with power. You could say much power is involved with sexuality, but it seems to me that power comes first. And let me put it this way. The decisions you make in this generation exercise power over your children in the same way that decisions made by your grandparents have exercised power over you. Do you see that connection, how clear it is? The choices they made dictated the world in which you live. I mean, here's an interesting thought. If you take a contraceptive pill, in a weird way, you have exerted power over the generation that might come. I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's simply the way that it is, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it. If the contraception deprived a life of its chance to exist, willy-nilly, you have made a power choice. Now, it's a power choice you may be perfectly entitled to make, but be entitled to make it knowing what it means. So power is very, 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 very crucial to human beings, and power comes right back to what I was saying about not knowing where we are and belief. Generally, people who wish to exercise power have no idea where they are, and an absolute terror of change, or a terror of losing themselves somehow. So they wish to exert a power over people in that way. Donald Trump's an interesting example of that. The man is terrified, you can see. With all these buildings, he's got his name on, he appears to be completely lost and is trying to work out where he is, just as we all are. So what really interested me was power, and how we use power, and particularly in a way, how individuals use power and how governments use power. So that with Sidney Schanberg, it's a very interesting relationship, isn't it? Sidney Schanberg had power over Dith Pran because Dith Pran loved Sidney. So this is a love story, really, about two men. And Sidney's power changed, because in a way, first of all, Dith Pran was doing everything he could to help Sydney, so he was in Sydney's power. But then, when Sydney felt he'd betrayed Pran because of who Sydney was, the power balance shifted, and suddenly Sydney's whole life was enthralled to Pran's, because he had to find out whether Pran was arrived. So power shifted in a rather beautiful way. But that power itself was exercised within power that was being exercised by the American government, or by American soldiers, or by American generals. Now, what interested me about that was the way that you go from the particular, from the small, the microcosm, to the macrocosm. And that comes right back to the thing I was talking to you about, which is why I went through that long preamble about choices. Because we can choose to be involved in what our government does, we can choose to be involved politically, or to opt out. But opting out is a kind of a choice, of course. So I was interested in setting up a situation where what you discover is everybody is really fighting over power. But that there's something about the fight over power which in the end is sort of useless. Because really what we're fighting over is truth, isn't it? Sharing reality. I mean, when the Vietnam War started, and this is quite interesting, I think, President Kennedy, who didn't much want to go into that war, by the way, sent some British observers from Malaya to go and talk to the American generals in Vietnam. And what the British in Malaya said, because they'd won against an insurgency of communists in Malaya, what the British said was, whatever you do, don't bomb. Whatever you do, don't use heavy artillery in this fight, because you are not fighting a world war. What you must do is what we did. You must send individual soldiers for long periods to set up safe villages so that villagers feel protected. And at the same time, you must make it clear to the Malayans, as they were then, that you support a democratic process. And don't send the soldiers home until the struggle is over. Now, whether you agree with that struggle or not, that was very interesting advice. General Westmoreland, who had been brought up in a military tradition, was incapable of learning because he believed that nothing changed, and he said, I've got the planes, I've got the guns, I'm going to damn well use them. And he did, against advice. That was his choice. Nixon allowed that to happen. So what did those bombings do? Well, we know what those bombings did. We know what bombings are doing now. I mean, think about it. You live in a village, you have your life, you do all the things that we love doing, and imagine it happened here. A bomb suddenly hits this lecture hall. All that beauty, all this human beauty, all this potential, all this love, all this creativity, all those things that I've explained, I hope to you beautifully, about the way in which nature has worked, are destroyed by what? By a choice. By a choice of fear, however. So then the question becomes, well, what happens inside that area? And that's what interested me. The Khmer Rouge were a response to years of colonialism, in a way, and a certain degree of anger. But I didn't want the Khmer Rouge to be seen as faceless, so we developed a character who's a Khmer Rouge leader who does an odd thing. He gives his son to Dith Pran because he wants to save his son. And what I'm saying is something quite important. I'm saying even underneath this structure, love was operating. So actually, the Killing Fields, as with the mission, is a story about love and power. Because, and this is the shocking thing, if you can find me a story that its heart does not touch those two themes, I will, well, I'll give you a hug. But you know what I'm saying. If you break down any story at its root, you'll find these are stories about choices, and those choices involve the battle between love and power and what those things might mean. And that's normal because we've explained how we are as human beings. We are both separate and part of a group. So to answer your question, it's an internal process. What happens is you think these thoughts and you ponder about these things, and suddenly a story emerges and you think, oh my God, that story enables me to express these thoughts. Not with an end in sight, because my end is not to say the Khmer Rouge were bad or that the Americans were bad. It's to get people to feel, just to feel what it's like. And that brings me to a very, very important thing about filming historical subjects, and that is your job when you're communicating history is to make people understand what it felt like at the time. So your job is not archaeology. Your job is to make people feel what it might have been like. An example of that, I did a film called Vatel. Vatel was about a cook, it's a true story again, who commits suicide because he's a brilliant cook and a brilliant showman. He's actually a director in a way, but a 17th century director, who's asked to go to the court by the king. And you think, well, why on earth would he commit suicide? Well, that's a different story. It's because he simply wanted to be a cook and not a politician. And that was the choice he was being offered. And directors are offered the same choice. Do we want to be careerist politicians, or do we simply want to make films? Which is why I don't stand in front of you as a director, but a man who makes films. Big difference. But to get people to feel what Versailles might have been like, when the costume designer came to me, she came to me with archaeologically perfect costumes, you know, with big sleeves and all the buttons, you know, the kind of thing you see it in the theatre. And I said, these won't work. And she said, well, why not? They're accurate. And I said, no, they aren't. They won't work because a modern audience looking at them will be in a position of just going, oh yeah, well, that's the clothes they wore. But that's not what they thought at the time. At the time, they looked at those clothes and went, wow, whoa, those are beautiful, those are extraordinary. So we have to find costumes to do that. So what we did was, I took her to a store that made clothes for pop stars. And we selected all the material that was material that pop stars wore. Clothes made out of strange metals and cloths that were mixed up with gold and all sorts of extraordinary things, stuff that didn't exist at that time. And instead of having big sleeves like this, you know, with those big cuffs, I just had the costumes cut on a bias, something David Bowie might have worn. A strange thing happened. The French press, which at the time was very rough, said this is the best representation of the court of Louis XIV that's ever been on film. But my friends, it was not the best representation. But what it did was, it made a modern audience feel what the French public would have felt when they saw those courtiers riding by, going, oh my God. And that's what you need to do, and that's what you need to do in history. So in the Killing Fields, the job was to make the people watching the film feel what the Cambodians might have felt. And that's communication, isn't it? It's to pass across feeling, not just intellectual ideas, but feeling. So it was a long answer to your question, but it was a good question. Any more? There's one here.
Necesito que luego alguien me lo traduzca, porque ando un poco mal con el inglés. Lo que quería preguntarle es, una película al final conlleva todo un proceso de creación que acaba pues, infundiendo unos valores y tal. Pero yo lo que le quería preguntar es cómo el haber creado esta película, que es la misión y todas las demás, cómo ese proceso de evolución en los personajes, de crear la historia, influye en ti.
I think I understand that question. I think what you were asking me is how does the story evolve? The characters, the personality, how does this grow? Where does it come from? Is that pretty accurate?
I think he's talking about, it's more as that, but how about the process between the inception of the idea of the story and how it becomes a film by developing plot, characters, and so on?
Right. Okay, I have to answer in English, obviously. But that's a very good question. You start with an idea, which may be what I've described, an idea about how does power work, how do people work one with the other. Then you find, if you're making a historical film, some point in history that appears to encapsulate the interplay of those ideas. And then you either write it or you work with a writer. In the case of The Mission, Robert Bolt had had a stroke. Robert Bolt was the writer, a brilliant writer and a brilliant man. And this is what's so extraordinary. He'd had a stroke and he could barely speak. I remember standing in front of his library of books, and he'd gone to the toilet, and I was just standing in his house, and there was every novel that you've ever seen, hundreds and hundreds of novels. And there was Stendhal and Balzac and Pasternak and Dickens and I mean everybody. Allende, every novel you can think of was there. And Robert Bolt came out and he looked at me looking at the shelf and he said, oh, it is horrible. I know I have read them, but gone. Wasn't that amazing? That's what the brain is. Love your brains, guys, or whatever it is that makes them, because it's keeping all that stuff there. He'd lost it. But he was having a journey of getting it back. So he'd say to me, he'd write something and say, is this good? And sometimes it wasn't, and I had to say no. So I'd have to go back and write it, think what it was he was saying, what I wanted, and bring it back. And he would say, oh, no, no, it is this. And bit by bit, we discovered what it was we wanted to say. And that process is very, very important. And the process is a learning process. In other words, you should have an idea of what you want to say, but it must be free. In other words, you must be free to learn. So have an idea of what you want to say, but don't be afraid to change it. You see, to have a thesis or a hypothesis in a film is a good place to start, but it's not a good place to end. Because if you end with the same hypothesis you started with, the writing has not been a learning process. And as you write, writing is a process of learning. It's a question of, well, I write this character, that doesn't feel right. Let me research what this character might have done. Oh, actually, he would have done this. But by making those changes, the story itself changes because you're trying to examine the real interrelationship of people, remembering that people are what I described, materializations of some energy, making choices. So your story has to go through an evolution. But when you're filming, it'll go through another evolution. For instance, when I filmed with the Wainana, they didn't speak any English, so everything was done, not much Spanish, so everything was done through a series of translators. But there was one wonderful moment where, in the scene where Altamirano, the cardinal, has gone to see them, and he's basically telling them that they have to go, and that the missions, they can't stop it. And the Wainana are all talking. What they actually said was, get rid of him. I'd kill him now. I mean, just kill him now. And the other one said, well, I couldn't really kill him now because what do we do? I never translated that because it really didn't matter, but in their faces you could see they were participating in the story. And Ray McAnally, who was playing the cardinal, was affected by the reality of the Indians. So he suddenly became a different Altamirano who was very touched and very moved by that moment. So because I didn't interfere, I just recorded it, his character suddenly got enriched because Altamirano wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a bureaucrat who was pained by what he was doing, like so many bureaucrats that we know. Like so many American bureaucrats must have been pained by what were doing in Vietnam and Cambodia, and I hope to God are pained by what they're doing in the Yemen and Iraq and all those places now, where they've exercised power without thought. So the evolution, it's an evolutionary process that must go on all the time. And you draw off your own knowledge, other people's knowledge, and what life teaches you may be more honest than your original thought. That makes sense.
Good morning, Mr. Joffe. I've always asked this question to every journalist, writer, filmmaker I've ever met, and is, what are the 3 essential things that a good communicator must have or must do to tell a good story?
Okay, well, again, that's a very good question, which I think in some ways I've begun to answer from my kind of view of what that is. And let's go back over that. The desire to communicate must come from, I believe, an honest base. And I think an honest base is affection, love, and that love may be a love of the truth, whatever the truth is. So I would say, first of all, a respect for the truth, however inconvenient that may be. That's one thing. That involves discovery. In other words, no film or communication should be a closed system. You can't communicate by somebody by saying, it is like this, what do you think? You have to say, what do you think about it being like this? There's a difference in the implication. In other words, communication is the art of leaving open the next sentence or leaving open the reply. So curiosity then trumps ideology. So you start off with an affection, a love for the person you're trying to communicate with, curiosity, which guides the communication into not being you telling them what to think, even by hiding it in a question, but by you genuinely allowing them to respond and feel what it is you wish to tell them. And so that's curiosity. And then persistence. You have to be persistent. In other words, your question is not enough. You have to go on and on and on until either you've tired the audience out, or they've found an answer that's interesting, or you've found an answer that you think is satisfactory and that you can't go further. So it has to be a voyage of discovery. So you have to be able to allow people to discover. I mean, you'll judge by what I'm saying, by what I've just done. And if you think back over what I've just done, it either will have fulfilled well, or medium-wise, or not at all, what I've just suggested. So my hope would be that by taking your time up, which I very much appreciate, I've given something in return that's helping you feel the importance of knowing who you are. And if you've got that, I've communicated my feeling about that to you in a way that honors your feelings about that and your ability to criticize it or feel it or not feel it. So that's very important. So the last thing I would say, and it's a much overused word, is humility. Just because you want to communicate doesn't mean you have anything to say. So it might be quite nice to communicate the fact that you don't know what it is you want to say and wonder what they want to say. So humility is also very important. So communication is not lecturing. And I hope that what we've been doing today is not actually a lecture, but has been a communication, which is why I come back to what I said at the very beginning, because there's kind of logic to the way I do things. I said to you at the very beginning, I don't stand in front of you as a director. I'll stand in front of you as a person with questions. And then we're on an equal playing field, because you're all people with questions. So there's not much difference between us. I've lived a bit longer, so I've had a bit longer to make mistakes. That's about the way it works.
First of all, thank you for coming, Mr. Joffe. When we try to communicate and understand others, we make mistakes, and also because we are humans. So about this process of learning, about everything that you've talked before, could you please say something more about this, like this process of learning about both successes and failures in this communicating process?
Oh, right. Well, yes, let's talk about mistakes, in a sense, the process of mistake. I remember when I was at school, going back to my father and hiding my maths exam results, which were really bad. And one day he said to me, he said, Roland, your report is very strange. Don't you do maths? And I said, well, yes. And he said, well, if you do maths, why is there no report? I said, really? What, there's no report? And he said, no, there's no report. And I can't believe if you do maths that the maths master hasn't written a report. Therefore, there's only one conclusion, my dear boy. And I said, oh, what's that, Dad? And he said, well, there is one, and you're hiding it. Because they all used to be on a separate page. I went, oh, yes. And he said, so I guess it was a bad report. And I said, yes. He said, meaning you made lots of mistakes. And I said, yes. And he said, good. Good boy. He said, because the rest of your reports are awful. I said, what they are? He said, yes, they say you're a very good pupil. And this is really boring when I read this. It means that you're fulfilling what your master's asked. I mean, there's no irritation. They're not saying you're a nightmare in the class. They're just saying, good. Oh, no. Bring me your mistakes. So I bring the mistakes, and he says, now we can have a conversation. There's something about the concept of maths you're not getting. And he began to explain to me why he thought maths was beautiful. And what I learned from that, what he was trying to teach me, is we only learn through mistakes. Look, that's the way the universe is constructed, so there's nothing odd about that. Because if you look at the universe, it is a series of experiments all the time. So whatever you do, and this really comes from my heart, don't be afraid. Because when you think about it, being afraid of making mistakes means being afraid of what, exactly? Well, not getting a tick of approval, many things. But that fear will stop you learning. So it's much better to plunge in and say, look, this is my answer, this is what I'm going to do. And then when you get it wrong, you begin to understand that there are ways of getting it right. Because if you get it right all the time, you don't really learn anything. I mean, do you? Because you're never quite sure why you got it right. But when you get it wrong, pretty quickly it becomes clear to you why that would happen. And then the whole question of success and failure is a very, very interesting one, because as communicators, you're going to go through that in your whole life. Forget about it. Because what does that mean? Being successful, being a failure. What does it actually mean? What you're talking about are values. What is valuable? Look, I'll give you an example. We live in a world where we're paid for pretty much everything we do. That's generally the position. Some things happen that we're not paid for, you can volunteer for things. But in the main, we live in a society that is payment obsessed. And we say, well, that's normal, that's the way it is. I mean, how else was society? Well, in the 1840s in England, there was an enormous political debate going on about what was called a fair day's wage. And a very famous writer at the time, a man called Thomas Carlyle, who was a historian, actually, wrote a pamphlet, and he said, I'm not against a fair day's wage, because indeed, everybody should be paid fairly for what they do. But we're not asking a very fundamental question, which is, what do we mean by a wage? What do we mean by payment? Because people are paid in very many different ways. You're paid by the respect of your peers. You're paid by doing something good and feeling good about it. He said, so I'm not saying that we shouldn't give a fair monetary value, but if we ignore all the rest, we're in danger of the following thing. This is a man writing in 1840. He said, we will get to a point where the only way we can judge something's value is by how much it earns. And when that happens, we will have no values at all, because we'll live in a time where when people get old and can't earn anything, we will think they're no longer valid. We will live in a time where unless a thing has a price on it, it has no value. And then what will we have done? Well, my dears, he wrote that in 1840, and isn't a lot of that true about what happens now? Don't we find ourselves saying, it was a terrible story, but it really sold very well. That's a ghastly song, but my God, 1 million people are watching it on YouTube. That's not the issue. The issue of success is the value. What value do you put on what you did? So I started off my career with tremendous success, which was always, to me, very worrying, because, well, I can't go on doing this all the time. But I learned very early on that the question was, I would value my career by the value of what I did. And I'm the one who decides whether it's valuable or not, and I'm the one who will decide whether I succeeded in expressing what I was doing or not. And that's really important, and that I should pass on to you, because your great strength will be the strength to hold your own values. And that's a beautiful thing, and that will help you communicate. Because if you hold your own values and the beauty of your values, you will understand the beauty of other people's, providing you fulfill the parameters I talked about earlier. So success and failure are ephemeral, because they require other people. So to be successful in the eyes of other people, yeah, it's pleasant, and it's kind of fun, and it's a lot better than people yelling at you, but it's not of itself crucially important. What you decide about what you do is where you put yourself on your own learning curve. How much have I succeeded in doing what I think I wanted to do? How did I rise to the challenge? Because let's face it, you take a movie, well, one movie has a budget of $150 million and tackles a war, and another one has a budget of $3 million and tackles a war. Well, they're not going to be able to produce the same kind of thing, and they just aren't, because the one that has all the Spielberg version probably can have 10,000 extras running up a beach and the one that's at $3 million probably has got 4 or 5 extras, so they'll never produce the same thing. So if the filmmaker who made the $3 million movie judges himself by the $130 million set of standards, he's failed. But a more interesting question would be whether the $130 million film is capable of the emotional strength and truth that the $3 million movie had. So the director is the only person of those two who will understand the limitations they had and how successful they were in it. So in a sense, as you are the directors and painters of your own lives, you are the ones who will decide how successful you are. And isn't that beautiful? Because what it's actually saying is, choice is in your hands. If you feel good about your choices, you will feel good about what you've done, even if it doesn't work. Is that a good answer? Well, look, I hate to say this, but I don't want to keep you here too long. And so let's maybe take one last question. Someone at the back, because they haven't had a chance to.
Okay, just let me find it because I wrote it down somewhere. Okay, so very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And you just spoke earlier about how sometimes it's not, I'm nervous, I'm sorry, there's a lot of people here. Sometimes it's not important to show people the story or character as much as it is important to make them feel the story or make them feel that they're in a certain time. So I'm studying audiovisual communication, and these past few weeks we've been crazy writing different scripts for class. And well, we face different characters and different stories in different situations, and sometimes to jump from one to another makes it really hard to actually put yourself in the character's shoes or in the character's situation. So I want to ask you what you do to make yourself feel that you're in that situation yourself, in order to later make an audience feel the same way.
Well, that's a really great question. Of course, you're dealing with the essential problem of trying to create character and story. Which one leads? Does the character lead the story? Does the story lead the character? Am I forcing this character to do something he or she wouldn't do in order to make the story work? And I think the way to do that's what I was saying earlier, which is you have to keep learning. In other words, have your story, but let your characters act on the story, and if they come up with things that surprise you, that's a very good thing. For instance, I'm in the process of writing a short story now, which is about a marriage that went very, very badly wrong, which involves the husband deciding he wants to go on a cruise to Mexico, and the wife doesn't want to go on a cruise to Mexico. This becomes a big row. The daughter says to her parents, you always row about these things, so she says to the dad, why don't you do something that mum likes on the cruise, then you go to Mexico. The mother's obsessed with Phantom of the Opera. So the husband finds a way of persuading her on the cruise, because on the cruise ship you can play in the Phantom of the Opera. So she wants to go. So they go to Mexico. When they get to Mexico, he discovers that he wants to go to Chichen Itza. She doesn't, because she's rehearsing for the Phantom of the Opera. By the way, these people barely communicate with each other. They've been married for 40 years. He goes to Chichen Itza. He has some kind of strange epiphany in Chichen Itza, and he discovers that he doesn't want to go back. So he doesn't get on the bus. And then he meets a man and goes on this extraordinary journey with him to Guatemala. His wife is in shock because she thinks her husband all these years has just left her. I didn't know at that point in the story what the wife was going to do. The story started in Guatemala, where the police find a dead body in the jungle. When they do an autopsy on the dead body, they find it's perfectly unharmed, but has no heart. And they don't understand how that's possible. I mean, where the heart should be, there just isn't a heart. That I knew when I started the story. Then I told the story up to the point where the wife gets the news that the husband has disappeared. And I spent a day wondering what to do next. And this is what happened. The wife herself, the character, didn't leave on the cruise ship. Everybody said to her, oh, your husband, you should divorce him, and all the friends on the boat were giving her the kind of standard way of behaving. But when she heard the whistle of the boat about to leave, she grabbed a suitcase, rushed off the boat, and found herself stranded on the harbor in Mexico and decided to go and look for her husband. I had no idea she was going to do that. But once I was in that situation, the story went through a shift that I didn't realize was going to happen. What in fact happened was he gets taken to Guatemala, and he falls in love with this woman who he thinks is a magician. And it leads through a long, complex thing of him being taken to the jungle and sacrificed to a Mayan god by cutting out his heart, where they cut out his heart. And what I discovered, I say when the heart was held up on the obsidian knife, for the first time in its life, it beat its last beats in happiness. I didn't know I was going to write that, but that's what I wrote. But the wife's story became the really interesting one as well, because she, struggling to find out where her husband was, ended up following a different route to Guatemala, in which she came across a group of miners' wives who had no money, who were trying to deal with a miners' strike where the military was involved, and we know what Guatemala's like, and she began to use up her own money to pay to keep these wives going. And in fact, before she knew it, this woman who had no life except the Phantom of the Opera is engaged with housewives in Guatemala in a real study, in a real battle, in a real existence of life. And then I began to realize what the end of the story was, because the end of the story is she gets arrested by the same police who found the body of her husband. Eventually they let her go, but the police chief, who's a woman, says, I believe you might be related to this body who we found. And she goes and sees the body, is indeed her husband, and the chief of police says to her, well, it's very strange because this body appears to have no heart. And the wife that night goes back to the hotel, who's now in a completely different world to the little village in England where she lived as the wife of an insurance agent, and she goes down on her knees and she prays, and what she said is, dear Tom, who was her husband, I don't know where your heart is, but I have to thank you because I have found mine. Now, do you see how the story evolved? Does that make sense to you? I can only give you a practical example. The character took the story over. I was writing about him. But in a strange way, I finished his story in an interesting way, but the story really transmuted to be about her, and in being about her slightly more than him, it was about the way in which human beings relate, and asked a basic question about marriage, which is, if marriage becomes a way in which you annihilate each other's hearts, is it something you should be doing? So shouldn't a marriage then be something that encourages both people to be as creatively engaged in life as possible? And that's a great basis for a story, but I didn't start off with that basis. I started off with a story about a bad marriage. And in writing about it, the characters told me what a good marriage might contain. And I discovered it. Does that answer your question in a way? That's the way to go. Know what it is you want to write about. Let the characters take you to a place that's a bit unexpected and go with it, and you will be surprised and delighted. Good.
So I think we have to finish here. Thank you very much for such a wonderful talk, Roland.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, let me just say this. The applause is yours. You were a wonderful group of listeners, and the fact is, you can't give a good talk without good listeners, so thank you.